If you've been in the mini painting hobby space, you'll often hear that you need to thin your paints. So why do we thin paints? Painting miniatures requires a fine touch, and thinning paints serves two purposes. It allows you more control over the paint itself on the model, and it allows you to build up the paint onto the model. And that might be confusing, but I'll get into that a little bit later here in the video. Oftentimes when you're pulling paint out of a pot or a bottle, dropper bottle, it's going to need to be thinned to some degree. Paint doesn't need to be thinned. It's all a preference and depends on how you want to paint your models. But most of the time, the paint needs to be thinned if you want to have more control over it. That really depends on the brand. I've seen some pretty thick paint come out of pots, and I've seen some paint that is pretty close to where I want it to be when I pull out of pots when I'm painting. That is typically what you're going to see when you start to pull paint out of your dropper bottle or your pots. So when we're thinning paints, what we're talking about is wanting more control over the paint that's going onto the model. Say you have a paint, you just pulled it straight out of the pot or the dropper bottle, you slap it on your brush, and you just go to town on your mini. Well, those fine details in the mini are likely going to get clogged up with all that thick paint. So it'll take away the detail in the mini, which is fine if that's what you want. You don't really care. You just want to get something on the table. But if you want to have a little bit more control, the paints need to be thinned to go onto the model purposefully. That's going to allow you to push the paint around in places you want to go, because if your brush is filled with paint, it'll flood the model and it'll just kind of go wherever. Then the other aspect of thinning paints is being able to apply multiple coats of paint. So you're basically reducing the opacity to be able to create different layers of paint on the model, and this can give you brighter more saturation. It can allow you to put undercoats of shadows and to kind of blend the color up into highlights, stuff like that with the thinner paints. So that is typically why people are going to thin paints. It can take more time, and it can be a scary thing to do. Now, if we are going to thin paints, there's multiple ways to do it. The only way that I've ever done it is with water. There are special products out there that you can buy to help thin paints. Water is perfectly fine when you're thinning paints. Usually what I'll do is I will put my paint down on the palette, then I'll take my brush and just barely dip it in my water cup, and then I will come from the side of the little globule of paint and kind of sweep the paint in with the water and mix it around. And I'll look for the consistency of the paint that's mixed with the water by looking at the trail that's left by my brush. If it's too thick, that trail won't fill in. If it's too thin, then it's hard to even see that trail. So when I was working on these two orc skulls out of the skull pack that I have, I did two versions, one with thick paint, one with my thin paint. I used 3 different hues of browns, so from a dark tone to a mid-tone and to a light tone. You can see here that I already have my base dark tone down pretty thin. Typically I'd go a little bit more, a couple more layers on this just to get more opacity on that darker color. But right now I'm working with the mid-tone trying to hit the higher points of the actual skull model and blending it down into the darker areas. So really we're just looking to sculpt out a section of the whole darker part. And then as we work our highlights up, we'll make that section a little bit smaller and smaller to kind of mimic highlights on edges and high points. So this one here is the one I globbed a bunch of paint on. You can see some of the details going. And this is the mid-tone. So I'm starting on the top of the head, trying to blend it back, and I'll try to get the other high points, like the nose, the top of the jawline, and some of the parts that protrude on the bottom of the jaw. It's not hard to get these points when you have your brush loaded like this. It's just hard to control where it's going, and it can just get messy real quick, especially when you try to put highlights and stuff in. You can sit and wait, but it does take much longer than if you're using thinner paints. Just to demonstrate, I went straight to the highlights. We can see that as soon as I put it on, it just kind of goes all over the place and spreads out way more than I'd initially like, which is expected with big globs of paint like this. You can try to blend it in like this. It's called wet blending. This is kind of a really quick and dirty version of that. It's just you have two wet paints that you blend together to kind of make that medium color. It's not bad, but it's if you want to do your best on your minis, this is not how you want to do it. So if you're painting your minis and it's globbing up like this and you want to do it a little bit better, just try thinning your paint some. Again, I don't think this is super bad. It could use some work, but it can definitely go on a table like this. So it's not 100% necessary for you to thin your paints, and it's not required. You can see how thin the lines are on this skull here. You can see I put some texture in the back, and this is with the thinner paints. I was able to control it a lot more. You can see the comparison here that they are just totally different as far as details go and how smooth the color transitions are. So if you're a beginner painter, the question is, should I thin my paints? It's if you want to. I think if you are trying your best and want to do better, then yes, you should thin your paints. If you don't care, you don't need to thin your paints. It can just kind of be daunting to paint so many thin layers on top of your models. I encourage you just to paint models. You'll get better as time goes on. Well, that's all I got for this one. If you found this helpful, go ahead, subscribe, like, comment, tell me how bad my audio was for this video. I will look to improve that. Otherwise, I will see you next time. Bye.